From Los Angeles, California, the entertainment capital of the world, it's the 80s Movie Podcast. I'm your host, Edward Havens. Thank you for listening today. On this episode, we'll be covering one of the oddest Part 3 movies to ever be made, Smokey and the Bandit, Part 3. But before we do, I owe you, loyal listener, an apology and an explanation. Originally, this episode was supposed to be about the movies of H.B. Toby Halicki, who brought car chase films back to life in the mid-70s with his smash hit, Gone in 60 Seconds. Part of the reason I wanted to do this episode was to highlight a filmmaker who doesn't get much love from film aficionados anymore, in part because this was the movie that literally made me the person I became. My mom was dating Toby during the making of the movie. I spent a number of days on the set as a 5-year-old, and I even got featured in a scene. And I thought it would be fun to get my mom to open up about a part of her life after my parents' divorce that I don't remember much of. And it turned into a discussion that made me question everything I became, much of which I will cover when I find the courage to revisit this topic, hopefully in time for its 50th anniversary this July. So for now, and to kind of stick with the car theme this episode was originally going to be about, we're going to do a quick take on one of the most bizarre and most altered movies to ever come out of Hollywood. As you may remember, Smokey and the Bandit was a 1977 hit film from stuntman-turned-director Hal Needham. Needham and Burt Reynolds had become friends in the early 60s, and Needham would end up living in Reynolds' pool house for nearly a dozen years in the 60s and 70s. Reynolds would talk director Robert Aldrich into hiring Needham to be the second unit director and stunt coordinator for the car chase scene in Aldrich's classic 1974 film, The Longest Yard, and Reynolds would hire Needham to be his second unit director on his own 1976 directorial debut, Gator. While on the set of Gator, the two men would talk about the movie Needham wanted to make his own directorial debut on, a low-budget B-movie about a cat-and-mouse chase between a bootlegger and a sheriff as they tried to outwit each other across several state lines. As a friend, Reynolds would ask Needham to read the script. The quote-unquote script was a series of handwritten notes on a legal pad. Needham had come up with the idea during the making of Gator when the Teamster transportation captain brought some Coors beer to the production team. And believe it or not, in 1975, it was illegal to sell or transport Coors beer out of states west of the Mississippi River because the beer was not pasteurized and needed constant refrigeration. Reynolds would read the quote-unquote script, which, according to Reynolds' 1994 autobiography, My Life, was one of the worst things he had ever read. But Reynolds promised his friend that if he could get a studio involved and get a proper budget and script for the film, Reynolds would make it. Needham would hire a series of writers to try and flesh out the notes from the legal pad into a coherent screenplay. And with a verbal commitment from Reynolds to star in it, he would soon get Universal Studios to agree to make Smokey and the Bandit to the tune of $5.3 million. After all, Reynolds was still one of the biggest box office stars at the time, and $5.3 million was small potatoes, especially when Universal was spending $6.7 million on the Super Bowl assassin thriller 2 Minute Warning, $9 million on a biopic of General Douglas MacArthur, and $22 million on William Friedkin's Sorcerer, an English-language version of the 1950 French novel, The Wages of Fear. Reynolds would take the lead as the Bandit, the driver of the chase car meant to distract the authorities from what the truck driver is hauling. Jerry Reed, a country and western star, would get cast as the Snowman, the truck driver who would be hauling the Coors beer from Texarkana, Texas, to Atlanta. Reed had only co-starred in 2 movies before, both starring Burt Reynolds, and even if they had almost no scenes together in the final film, their rapport on screen was obvious. Sally Field, a television star who needed a big movie on her resume, would take the role of Carrie, the runaway bride who joins the Bandit in his chase car. Field had just completed Sybil, the dramatic television movie about a woman with multiple personality disorder, which would break Field out of the sitcom world she had been stuck in for the past decade. Richard Boone, the star of the longtime television western Have Gun, Will Travel, would be considered as the sheriff, Buford T. Justice, in pursuit of the Bandit throughout the movie, but Reynolds wanted someone who was a bit more crazy, a bit more dangerous, and a heck of a lot funnier. And who wouldn't think of comedy legend Jackie Gleason? Shooting on the film would begin in Georgia on August 30th, 1976, but not before some pencil pusher at Universal Studios showed up 2 days before the start of production to inform Needham and Reynolds that they needed to cut $1 million from the budget by any means necessary. And the guys did exactly that, reducing the number of shooting locations and speaking roles. The film would finish shooting 8 weeks later, on schedule and on budget. Well, on a reduced budget, and when it was released in May 1977, just 6 days before the initial release of Star Wars, it bombed. For some reason, Universal Studios decided the best way to open a movie about a bunch of good old boys in the South was to give it a big push at the world-famous Radio City Music Hall in the heart of Manhattan, along with an hour-long Rockettes stage spectacular between shows. The Radio City Music Hall could accommodate 6,000 people per show. Tickets for the whole shebang, movie and stage show, were $5, when the average ticket price in Manhattan at the time was $3.50. And in its first 6 days, Smokey and the Bandit grossed $125,000, which sounds amazing until you're told the cost of running Radio City Music Hall for a week, stage show and all, was $186,000. And in its second week, the gross would fall to $102,000 and to $90,000 in week 3, and Universal would be locked into Radio City for several more weeks. But it wouldn't be all bad news. Universal quickly realized the error in opening in New York first and rushed to book the film into 381 theaters in the South, including 70 in the Charlotte area, 78 in and around Jacksonville, 97 theaters between Oklahoma City and Dallas, another 57 between Memphis and New Orleans, and 79 in Atlanta, near many of the locations the film was shot. And in its first 7 days in just those 5 regions, the film would gross a cool $3.8 million. Along with the $102,000 from Radio City, the film's $3.9 million gross would be the second highest in the nation, behind Star Wars. And despite bigger weekends from new openers like The Deep, Exorcist II, and A Bridge Too Far, Smokey and the Bandit would keep going and going and going, sticking around in theaters for more than 2 years in some areas, and grossing more than $126 million. Naturally, there would be a sequel. But here's the funny part. Smokey and the Bandit 2, a Universal movie, would be shot back-to-back with Cannonball Run, produced by the Hong Kong film company Golden Harvest as a vehicle to break their star Jackie Chan into the American market. Both films would also star Burt Reynolds and be directed by Hal Needham. Filming on Smokey and the Bandit 2 was supposed to start in August of 1979, but would be delayed until January 1980 because the film Reynolds was working on in the late summer of 1979, Rough Cut, went way over schedule. While the budget for the sequel would be $10 million, more than double the cost of the original film, the overall production was not a very pleasant experience for most involved. Needham was feeling the pressure of trying to finish the film ahead of schedule so he would have some kind of break before starting Cannonball Run in May 1980, and because several of the other actors, including Roger Moore, were already locked into other movies after shooting was completed on that film. Burt Reynolds and Sally Field had started dating during the making of Smokey and the Bandit in 1976, and both of them signed their contracts to appear in the sequel in 1979. But by the time shooting started in 1980, the pair had broken up, and they were forced to pretend to be in love, and side by side in the Bandit's Trans Am for a couple months. One of the few things that would go right on the film was a complex chase scene that could only be shot one time, for the end of the sequence would be the destruction of a 64-year-old roller coaster in suburban Atlanta. But they got the shot. Needham would get a few weeks between the end of shooting Smokey and the Bandit 2 and the start of Cannonball Run, but the production on the latter film would be put on hold a couple of times for a few days each time, as Needham would have to go back to Los Angeles to supervise the editing of Smokey and the Bandit 2. Smokey and the Bandit 2 would make its planned August 15, 1980 release, and would have a spectacular opening weekend, $10.8 million from 1,196 theaters, but would soon drop off, barely grossing half the first film's box office take. It would still be profitable, but Needham, Reynolds, and Field all nixed the idea of teaming up for a third film. Reynolds had been wanting to distance himself from his good old boy 1970s persona. Field was now an Oscar-winning dramatic actress, and Needham wanted to try something different. We'll talk about that movie, Megaforce, no time. But despite losing the interest of the main principles of the first two movies, Universal was still keen on making a third film. The first mention would be a line item in the Los Angeles Times calendar section on August 28, 1981, when, within an article about the number of sequels that were about to gear up, including Grease 2 and Star Wars 3, aka Return of the Jedi, that Universal was considering a third Smokey movie as a cable television movie. In May 1982, Variety noted that the reduced budget of the film, estimated at under $5 million, would not accommodate Reynolds' asking price at the time, let alone the cost of the entire production, and that the studio was looking at Dukes of Hazzard star John Snyder as a possible replacement as the Bandit. But in the end, it was decided that Jackie Gleason would return not only as Sheriff Buford T. Justice, but that he would, in several scenes, be playing the Bandit as well. Thus we begin the wild ride of the third film in the Smokey and the Bandit cinematic universe. Smokey is the Bandit, Part 3. It would take 11 different versions of the script written over the course of 6 months to get Gleason to sign off, because somehow he was given script approval before filming would begin. Paul Williams and Pat McCormick would return for the third time as Little Enos and Big Enos, and the storyline would find the Burdett father and son making a bet with Sheriff Justice. Justice and his son Junior must deliver a big stuffed swordfish from Florida to a new seafood restaurant they are opening in Texas. If Justice can get the big stuffed swordfish from point A to point B in an allotted time, the Burdetts would give him $250,000, which Justice could use towards his impending retirement. If he doesn't, however, Justice would have to surrender his badge to the Burdetts, and he would retire in disgrace. Dick Lowry, who had been directing episodic television and TV movies for several years, including 3 episodes of Buck Rogers in the 25th Century and the TV movie adaptation of Kenny Rogers' hit song The Gambler, would be making his feature directing debut on Smokey is the Bandit, Part 3. Production on the film would begin in Florida on October 25, 1982, and last 2 months, ending 2 days after Christmas, with most of the shooting happening in Florida. Lowry and his team would assemble the film over the course of the next 3 months, before Universal held its first test screening on the studio lot in March of 1983. And to say the screening was a disaster would be an understatement. The audiences didn't understand what the hell was going on here. They wondered how Justice, as the Bandit, could be in bed with a character credited only as Blonde Bombshell, who looks at him the way women in 1982 would have looked at Burt Reynolds. They wondered why a plot twist in the very last scene was presented, that Dusty, who had been traveling with Buford T. Justice as the Bandit, was really Big Enos's daughter, when it affected nothing in the story before or after its reveal. But mostly they were confused as to how one actor could play both title characters at the same time. Like, is Justice seeing himself as the Bandit? Seeing himself behind the wheel of the Bandit's signature black and gold Pontiac Trans Am? And a beautiful country music DJ played by Colleen Camp as his companion, all while actually driving his signature sheriff's car with his son Junior as his constant companion? The studio had 2 choices. One, pony up a few extra $1 million to rewrite the script and try to lure Reynolds back to play the Bandit. Or 2, bury the movie and take the tax write-off. The second choice was quickly ruled out, as a teaser trailer for the film had already been released to theaters several weeks earlier, and there seemed to be some interest in another Smokey and the Bandit movie, even though the trailer was just Gleason as Justice, standing in front of a large American flag, wearing a military-style uniform and giving a speech to the camera, not unlike the one George C. Scott gave at the start of the 1970 Best Picture winner Patton. You can find the link to that teaser trailer for Smokey is the Bandit Part 3 on our website at the80smoviepodcast.com. So, the studio goes down to Jupiter, Florida, where Reynolds had been living for years, and made him a sizable offer to play the Bandit for literally a couple of scenes. Since Gleason as Bandit has only one line in the film, and since most of the shots of Gleason as Bandit were done with wide lenses to hide that it wasn't Gleason doing any of the driving during the number of scenes involving the Trans Am and stunts, they could probably get everything they needed with Reynolds in just a day or two. But Reynolds would say no to that offer. Strangely, he would agree to come back to the film as the Bandit for an extended sequence towards the end of the film. We'll get to that in a moment. So with Reynolds coming back, but not in the capacity they wanted him in, the next thought was to go to Jerry Reed, the country singer and actor who had been playing Bandit's partner, the Snowman, in the first two films. Reed was agreeable to coming aboard, but he wanted to play the Bandit, or more specifically, Cletus, pretending to be the Bandit. The film screenwriters Stuart Birnbaum and David Dashev were called back in to do yet another rewrite. They would only have 3 weeks, as there was only a short window in April for the production team to get back together to do the new scenes with Reed and Colleen Camp. Dusty would go from being a country radio station DJ to a car dealership employee who literally walks off the job and into Cletus as the Bandit's Trans Am. Reed's role as Cletus as Bandit was greatly expanded, and Dusty's dialogue would be altered to reflect both her new career and her time in the car with Cletus. The reshoots would last a few weeks, and Lowry would have a final cut ready for the film's planned August 12th theatrical release. It is often stated on this podcast and other sources that in the 1980s, August was mostly the dumping ground of the studio's dogs, hoping to get a little bit of ticket sales before Labor Day, when families look at going on vacation before the kids have to go back to school. And the weekend of August 12th through 14th in 1983 was certainly one way to prove this argument. Smokey and the Bandit Part 3 would be the second highest grossing new release that weekend, which is surprising in part because it would have a smaller percentage of prints out in the market compared to its competition, 498 prints to be exact, almost exclusively in the southern United States. The bad news is that the film would barely make it in the top 10 that weekend. Cujo, the adaptation of the 1981 Stephen King novel, would be the highest grossing new opener that weekend, making $6.11 million in ticket sales and barely missing the top spot, which was held for a third week by the Chevy Chase film Vacation, which had earned $6.16 million. Risky Business, which was making its young lead actor Tom Cruise a movie star, would take third place with $4.58 million. And then there was Return of the Jedi, which had been out for 3 months by this point, the Sylvester Stallone-directed Saturday Night Fever sequel Staying Alive, the Eddie Murphy-Dan Aykroyd comedy Trading Places, the god-awful Jaws 3D, War Games, and Krull, all which had been out for 3 to 11 weeks by this point, all grossing more than Smokey and the Bandit Part 3, which made just $1.73 million in ticket sales. But having it much worse was The Curse of the Pink Panther, Blake Edwards' attempt to reboot the Inspector Clouseau series with a new American character who may or may not have been the illegitimate son of Clouseau, which grossed an anemic $1.64 million from 812 theaters. And then there was The Man Who Wasn't There, the 3D comedy featuring Steve Guttenberg, that was little more than a jumbled copy of Foul Play in North by Northwest that arrived too late in theaters to ride the now-dead stereo-optic movie craze, which took in $1.38 million from 980 theaters. In its second week, Smokey and the Bandit Part 3 would only lose 5 screens, but it would lose 52% of its opening weekend audience, bringing in just $830,000 that weekend. Week 3 would see the film lose nearly 300 screens, and it would only bring in $218,000. Week 4 was Labor Day weekend itself, with its extra day of ticket sales. And you'd think that Universal would just cut and run since the film was not doing great with audiences or critics. Yet they would expand the film back to 460 theaters, including 47 theaters in the greater Los Angeles metropolitan area. The gambit worked a little bit, with the film bringing in $1.3 million during the extended holiday weekend, bringing the film's 4-week total gross to $5.02 million. and it would slowly limp along for a few more weeks, mostly in dollar houses. But Universal would stop tracking it after its fifth weekend in theaters, giving the film a final box office total of $5,678,950. Oh, I almost forgot about the Burt Reynolds thing. Burt did film his scene, a 4-minute or so cameo towards the end of the film, where Justice finally catches up to Cletus as the bandit, but in Justice's mind's eye, he sees Cletus as Burt as the bandit, where Burt as the bandit does nothing more than a half-ass read off of his lines while sitting behind the wheel of the Trans Am. I watched the movie on Paramount Plus back in January 2024, when I originally planned on recording this episode. But it's no longer available on Paramount Plus, nor is it available on Peacock, which is owned and operated by Universal, where the film was once available. And in May of 2024, the only way to see Smokey and the Bandit, Part 3, is on long out-of-print low-quality DVDs and Blu-rays. JustWatch.com says the film is available on Apple TV's Showtime channel, but I can't find any Showtime channel on Apple TV, nor can I find the movie doing a simple search on Apple TV. The first two are on Apple TV as part of AMC Plus's channel. It's all so darn complicated. But like I said, I watched it for the first and probably last time earlier this year, and truth be told, it's not a totally painful film. It's not a good film in any way, shape, or form. But what little good there is thanks to Colleen Camp, who was not only gorgeous, but had an amazing sense of comic timing. Anyone who saw her as Yvette the Maid in the 1985 comedy Clue already knows this. Like a handful of film buffs and historians, I'm still wildly interested in seeing the original cut of the film after more than 40 years. If Universal can put out 3 different versions of Orson Welles' Touch of Evil, including a preview cut that was taken away from Welles and re-edited without his consent, in the same set, then certainly they can release both versions of Smokey and the Bandit Part 3. But let's face facts. Dick Lowry is no Orson Welles, and there's practically zero calls for this kind of special treatment for the film. I just find it odd in this day and age, the only thing that's escaped from the original version of the film after all this time is a single image of Gleason as the bandit, which you can also find on this episode's page at our website. Thank you for joining us. We'll talk again soon. Remember to visit this episode's page on our website, the80smoviepodcast.com, for extra materials about Smokey and the Bandit Part 3, including links to Smokey and the Bandit fan sites that have their own wealth of materials relating to the movie, and a video on YouTube that shows about 20 minutes of deleted and alternate scenes used in the television version of the movie, which may or may include an additional shot from the original movie that shows Dusty riding in the back of Big Enos's red Cadillac convertible. The 80s Movie Podcast has been researched, written, narrated, and edited by Edward Havens for Idiosyncratic Entertainment. Thank you again. Good night.